If the Bible's got you tied in knots, if you're burdened with religious thoughts, come grab a drink and join the choir. It's Heretic Happy Hour.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Heretic Happy Hour podcast. I am Keith Giles, one of three amazing hosts of this incredible podcast. I am the author of several books, including one that just came out called Jesus Undefeated, Condemning the False Doctrine of Eternal Torment. And, I do a few other things on the side when no one's looking. But I'm also joined by my other two co-hosts, Jamal and Matt. So guys, why don't you guys, say howdy and introduce yourself.
Hi, friends. My name's Jamal Javanji. It's great to be back on the Heretic Happy Hour podcast with you. I'm the author of Living for a Living that came out in the past decade. But I'm actually a recent reader of a book. And I read recently a book by the name of Life After Life. That's the title of it. And it's actually a compilation of 100 near-death experiences by an MD doctor who researched 100 people who have clinically died and came back and had incredible experiences, and he compiled it in a book. It's fascinating. But that's me.
Well,
great to be with you.
That's you. That's you in a nutshell. A Buckeye.
A Buckeye. I'm a Buckeye.
I just learned what a Buckeye was thanks to you, Jamal. It's a nut.
Yes.
Well, you know what? That explains a lot.
Does that explain a lot right there?
Yes. I would have said he was a nut a long time ago, but now all I have to say is he's a Buckeye.
Actually, a Buckeye is a poisonous nut, so it cannot be eaten.
All right. Well, that makes me, Matt DiStefano, the author of I don't know, how many books by now? 5? But only 3 matter because only 3 are with choir. So, yes, happy again to be here. And what do we have left in this Culture War series? We got this one, and we got one more coming up. Mm-hmm. Is that true?
I think at least one more. Yes, we cannot speak its name.
Oh,
but yes,
cannot.
there is one after this one coming up, and it's going to be amazing.
All right. Well, good. Before we get into all that good stuff, definitely want to give a huge shout out and a huge thanks to our sponsor today, which is Wild Foods. And their website can be found at wildfoods.co. And today, I want to actually talk about their Cocotropic Superfood Cocoa Drink Mix because I tried it and it is wonderful. So what they've done is they've got these adaptogenic mushrooms, and they're the perfect addition to your morning coffee, which is what I did, or butter coffee routine. If you haven't used any mushroom in your coffee, you're missing out. And I agree with that because I was so focused. I was full of energy. My wife did the same thing. She was putting it in her coffee. And it really does help you focus. And there's so much research out there on the benefits of mushrooms. And Wild Foods has the highest quality available on the market. So go to wildfoods.co and check out all the literature. And it's really good stuff. And I have an announcement that you get 12% off if you're a listener of the Heretic Happy Hour. So
how do you do that?
I'm going to tell you. Use the promo code Happy Hour 12 Happy Hour 12 when you check out, and you'll get 12% off your order. And if you don't like it, well, I liked it. I liked that mushroom stuff in my coffee.
Well, Matt, I don't want to put you on the spot, but
please
can I just ask you a few questions?
Yes.
Maybe you can just okay. Do you in your assessment of the product, would you say that there's ever any artificial flavorings?
No, absolutely not.
Never.
Well, it's not just my opinion. That's what they say.
That's a fact. Okay.
That's a fact.
Okay. I just wanted to check with you. Does it come from small farms all over the world?
That's what they say, and that's important.
That is important. That's cool.
What I'm curious about is because you mentioned it has turmeric powder, but a lot of times it's got like a really strong taste. I mean, is that the case with this Cocotropic drink?
I didn't taste any strong turmeric powder. It tasted like it made my coffee taste like a mocha.
Ooh.
Yeah, and Keith, I think it gives you the benefits of turmeric powder without the strong taste. I think that's what I would say about the product.
Well, that's great.
That's cool.
Wow.
So do it, folks.
Yeah, and everybody wins if you do it.
Win.
Oh, by the way, thank you for that, Matt. By the way, I really appreciate that. we have a hotline, as everybody probably knows, but we still get questions. We do have a hotline. If you're new to the podcast, we have a hotline. The number is 240-343-7379. Again, 240-343-7379. You can call that and you can leave a voicemail. You could text it. Anything you want, 24/7. We love to get love on the hotline. So
I love to get love.
Call that. And by love, I really just mean interaction. But we do have a voicemail from what I hear. So can we cue that up?
Hi guys, my name is Louise. I'm calling from Stratford-upon-Avon in England. Love your show. I had a question. I know you talk a lot about deconstructing your faith and so on. Just wondered if you have any thoughts on deconstructing the ego, and if you think that's a natural follow-on after you've deconstructed faith to deconstruct the ego and what that might look like. Thanks. Bye.
All right, guys, what do you think?
I feel like we should let Jamal go first, because I feel like this is. I could feel him getting excited through the screen about this call.
I know. Yeah.
Well, first of all, how cool is it that we have listeners in England? Isn't that cool? I just think
yeah. And the hotline works all the way across the pond.
Yeah, they have a cable.
Yeah.
It connects the.
Yeah.
Which is it's still amazing. I know it's been around for a while, but it's really cool. First of all, thank you for calling and listening all the way from England. I love the accents that the people who live in that island have. It's fascinating. I love it. But I will say that, first of all, great question. Deconstructing the ego. I might put it a little differently for just my understanding. I don't think the ego is something that needs to be deconstructed as much as it needs to be observed. Because if you can observe your ego, look at it, then what it does is it brings something else into view, which is the observer. So the one who's looking at the ego is not the ego. So the problem with the ego is when you're unconscious to it. Because when you're unconscious to it, it's like a fish in water. You don't see the water because you're in it. So when you step out and observe the ego, there's another self that is not the ego. And that is what I would say is your truest and highest. And I would say your divine self. And if you can observe the ego, it has a story. Some of that story is tragic. Some of the story is not so tragic. It's not good or bad. It just is your experience. But when you step outside of it, the deconstruction really happens, and the reconstruction actually happens the more you get present to the observer self, which is your highest self. And there's a distinction, and it's a huge contrast between the ego and the truest and highest self. So you don't really need to deconstruct as much as you just need to watch it and observe it, in my opinion.
Yeah, but maybe we need to deconstruct the concept of ego, because I hear a lot of people, and I can't specify which circles they roll in, but I hear a lot of people talking about how the ego is bad or we need to kill the ego. And I think that gets too dualistic and swings the pendulum too far. Like, we do operate from the ego a lot, and that leads to problems. But I think the ego, like you're saying, has its place. And so maybe we just need to deconstruct the idea that the ego is good or bad, and the ego just is.
Right. So it's not it's not this all or nothing thing. The ego is bad and you must 100% suppress it. It's that, in other words, the problem isn't ego. It's just maybe a bad ego, or it's not an ego that's under control, or ego that's out of control. Right?
I would say your ego not knowing its proper function and role, and overstepping its boundaries. Maybe.
Yeah, it's a tool. It's like anything. It's a tool that you can use for functioning. But it's when you're unconscious to it. That's when, and because the ego has, there's a shadow to it. There's trauma and there's pain in it. That's where suffering and pain is found in the ego self. So that's my understanding. So when you are operating from that place and you're unconscious to it, then you perpetuate violence, victimization, victimhood, powerlessness. All of these things come from the ego. And so that's why you want to, but it's not bad. You just want to, there's other positive aspects to it, but you just want to, my opinion is you really want to observe it so you know how to use it, because there's times to use it and there's times to not use it,
right.
So, that's
what we should do. Yeah. We should do an episode on this.
Yeah, totally.
Down the road. Yeah.
And we also have a text that came into the hotline. So can we cue that up? Okay. Quote, "Hi guys, I'm Kosh, pronounced like Josh, but with a K. I love your podcasts and blogs. Thank you for being open-minded and loving. You guys have a bigger impact than you know on Christians like me who feel alone and surrounded by fundamentalism all the time. I had a question that I would love to know your thoughts on. After going on a deployment to Iraq last year, I came back with my belief in just war theory thoroughly shaken. The idea that sometimes violence is necessary to achieve long-term peace or stop a greater evil just doesn't seem sustainable to me. It seems like a lot of the violence that I was directly responsible for or witnessed there was not conducive to creating healing or restoration in any way. What are your guys' thoughts on the just war theory and if violence is ever a viable option for Christians?" Unquote. Wow. Well, that text, first of all, that text is extremely timely.
Yeah.
Because, instead of, we could answer the caller's question, but let's just devote the rest of the episode to that question.
That's a great idea.
Yeah. So that, I think it brings up our next segment of the show, which is our Heretic of the Week.
It's the Heretic of the Week.
Hi, I'm Martin Brooks, and some people call me a heretic.
Hi, Martin. How you doing?
I'm doing good. That was an enthusiastic greeting. Thanks, guys.
Pardon our enthusiasm.
It's part of the shtick.
All right.
So, so Martin, thank you so much for being our guest on the Heretic Happy Hour podcast. And so I guess what we always do is when we kick these things off is we always want to know, why is it that some people would consider you a heretic?
Well, I think it started when I came back from the mission field and started saying nice things about Muslims. Many of the things that I had been taught about Muslims were only partially correct. And when I went to the mission field and actually met Muslims and had good Muslim friends and was able to ask them about some of the things I'd been taught, I realized we weren't being very grace-filled toward Muslims. So then I came back to the States and said, maybe we need to rethink what we're saying and how we're approaching Muslims. And that's when I got called heretic.
Yeah.
So what were some of those specific things that stand out?
Just sort of demonizing the other, assuming the worst about the other. You would hear things, there were factual things like Muslims worship a moon god. Well, I've never met a Muslim that claimed to worship a moon god.
Okay.
Yeah,
that's new to me. I haven't heard
well,
that.
it has to do with their symbol that they use, and people project onto them.
The crescent.
Yeah,
crescent.
right.
So, but Martin, by that analogy, a Muslim could correctly say that Christians worship a wood god because we have this symbol of a cross, and so we worship wood.
Or the death penalty.
Or the death penalty, yes, exactly. We worship state-sponsored execution.
Right. And I never used that particular argument. I was just always kind of taken aback when people quote some web source as though that's authoritative. And you usually ask these people, how many Muslims do you actually know? And it's usually pretty low to none.
Yeah, I think that's the key, isn't it? I think that was my experience, that I probably did, because you don't have anything to compare it to. I used to sort of assume that, some of those things I heard about Muslims were true until I met some, like you said. And then once I started meeting them and getting to know them, and I knew their names and I had conversations with them and we had shared meals together and things like that, it was suddenly like, wow, they're not like this at all. They don't all want to kill us. They don't hate us for our freedoms. They are not trying to impose.
And, and when you say they, there's 1.5 to 1.8 billion Muslims in the world. And I'm sure whatever story you come up with, you can probably find one that will agree with you. But what I think has happened is people have had anecdotal experiences. This is a gracious version. They've had an anecdotal experience with a Muslim that they've encountered somewhere. And so then they come back and they write a book about it. and extrapolate that and think that everybody, claim that all Muslims believe this particular thing, whatever it is, about jinn or alcohol or oppression of women or Sharia law. And you can just find a whole lot of variety as you encounter Muslims around the world. Most Muslims don't even live in the Middle East. They live in Indonesia or India, outnumber the Muslims in the Middle East. So we just project too much on the community, and we just want to extend grace to them. So when I began to challenge the church on those topics, it just got a lot of pushback.
Mm-hmm. And so what are some things that you have found to be? It seems like this is there's two fronts, right? There's sort of what's effective in that you have found in helping Christians to rethink this, and then what's been effective. I guess maybe we can do this as a second question is, what is effective in speaking to Muslims as compared to the us and them kind of approach?
Right. So now I work with a ministry called Peace Catalyst, and we essentially try to create safe spaces for Muslims and Christians to get to know each other. And we do that in a lot of different ways, but sometimes it's hard to convince Christians to come engage Muslims. There's this fear that people have based on filling in the gaps in their own minds. We know some things about Muslims, and then we try to create this narrative that makes sense to us, and we end up filling in the narrative with fiction. So I have found for conservative Christians, which is my background, that you need to use scriptural examples to sort of give them permission to engage. Things like Jesus intentionally taking his disciples across the sea to engage the Gentiles. Things like Peter's vision in Acts 10, and going into Cornelius's house. And when he shows up, he says, "Now, the law says it's forbidden for me to be with you, but God has shown me that, he is more inclusive than my religious system was." You see is it Acts 17 where Paul's on Mars Hill and says, God made from one man all the nations, and he determined the times and the places that they would live. And he did so that people would reach out to him and find him, though he's not far from each one of us. So it's always perplexing to me why believers, Christian people, would say, why are all these internationals, why are all these foreign-born people coming to the United States? Well, Paul thought that God designed it that way, that God determined when and where people would live. And he's given the church, 2,000 years to figure out how to respond to that. And right now we're choosing fear over engagement. The Bible narratives help the Christians. And yet I've also stood in front of church groups and you see people with their arms crossed.
Yeah.
Like, I'm projecting on them that they're thinking, you're naive. You don't know that they're all out to kill us, and so I have found that sometimes you have to start not with the Bible with Christians. You have to start with Maslow's hierarchy and address the needs of, okay, what is this about our group identity that is so threatened by another group? Why is your safety not a factor? In the U.S., the Muslims make up 1% to 3% of the total population. We just don't have much. Shouldn't have any fear that they're going to somehow get a political voting bloc that can impose Sharia law on all of us. And in fact, as a minority, they are very gracious and accommodating. They want you
Right.
to know that they're not connected to or associated with the crazies in their tribe. It's not that there aren't people that call themselves Muslim that want to hurt um, Americans or Christians or people that don't call themselves Muslim. But the same could be said of white nationalists who call themselves Christians. So every tribe has its crazies,
Yes.
and you need
Yes.
to honor the people that you meet. I say to Christians all the time, you need to talk to the person across the table from you instead of some stereotype that we've made up in our head.
Exactly.
I love that you were talking about the Bible earlier and listing off these stories that we could mention. And we could mention Luke 4 when Jesus mentions naming the Syrian and they want to throw him off a cliff for saying that our faith should transcend the borders. You have to remember our greatest prophets were blessing those who are our enemy. But I think what you guys are doing, and correct me if I'm wrong, and correct me if this is wrong, that it doesn't have as bigger impact, is there's this whole thing about like social contact hypothesis that only when we befriend the other, quote unquote, is when our minds actually get changed about them. So we could do biblical things all day long, but I think on the ground with what you guys are doing is probably having a much bigger impact in shedding the fear and putting aside the need to other the
Correct.
other.
So, back in the 50s, Gordon Allport wrote a book called The Nature of Prejudice.
Yeah.
And he was dealing with race issues, but he talked about scapegoating and how we label people as a way to dismiss them. We will call someone a heretic. We will call somebody a Muslim as though that's an insult.
Right.
We just saw a meme of Congresswoman Pelosi, dressed in a hijab as though that was an insult. And I love that you mentioned Luke 4 because that is foundational to what we do. Jesus comes to his hometown and says, "I've come to proclaim good news. Freedom for the prisoner, good news for the poor, sight to the blind." It's the year of Jubilee.
Right.
And then later in that chapter, when it became clear that this year of Jubilee, this expansive version of the gospel of the kingdom, wasn't just for the religious tribe. It wasn't, it was for the Syrian general. It was for the woman, the foreign woman who took care of the prophet. God's reaching out to other. The Spirit of God is active in other places than just our small tribe. So what Peace Catalyst does is try to find how, where is the Holy Spirit active in our Muslim friends? What can I affirm? Richard Rohr talks about the universal Christ. Where can I see Christ at work in others? You think about Melchizedek showing up. God was working outside of the Jewish religious system. You think about the wise men showing up, have been looking at the stars in Persia, but Jesus is important, because God was doing something significant. So when we approach our Muslim friends, the message is not trade your list of rules for my list of rules. The posture is come alongside of them and ask and observe what God is doing among them. What can we learn from them? It's like you fast for 30 days each year, from sun up to sun down. If I miss lunch, I get a headache. So how does this fasting thing work for you? At the end of it, do you feel so close to God, or at the end of it, are you like, whew, I'm glad that's over. Now I can go back to normal life. But it's this respectful approach of of you and me together pursuing God. And that's what Peace Catalyst does. We try to set up those scenarios where we can walk together.
Yeah. Well, I think that's amazing. I have my best friend is Buddhist, and the analogy we use is that my perspective, I'm pointing at the moon, and his perspective, he's pointing at the moon, and our Muslim brothers and sisters are pointing at the moon from their perspective, but we're all pointing in the same direction, right? So yes, of course, there's differences. Yes, of course, we have our intricacies and our doctrines and our dogmas and our theologies and our history, for good or for bad. But we're all, I think, trying to say the same thing, which is, what is the true nature of God? What is God really like? And how do we live in relationship with divinity?
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So we try to move it from being a dualistic us against you to you and me together.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I like what you said, Martin, about sort of taking the posture of learning something like we have something to learn. Because I think the root of that fear is ignorance, right? And so one of the best ways to overcome that fear is to remove the ignorance, and the only way to do that is to actually sit across the table from people who are different and listen to them and learn something and adopt that posture of learning. And that's what I found the more time I've spent with Muslim people. I posted several times on Facebook, Muslims are beautiful people and dearly loved of God. And you would think I had just said the most, offensive, heretical thing you could possibly say, when I can't even believe any Christian has any basis for getting offended or angry or upset that I would suggest that Muslims are beautiful people and dearly loved of God. But oh my gosh, they do. And again, it's because of these assumptions that they have. And again, they've never met any Muslim people, so they don't know that they're beautiful people, and that they don't know, they're not open to the idea that God might love them as well.
Well, we're all created in the image of God. That we're related through Adam and Eve, or through our history. And can we affirm that in the other, or do we just look for where we're different? And we're encouraging people to look for where we're the same.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what we must realize is, if we just look at Christianity, we're as different.
For sure.
I mean, Protestants are as different as Catholics, are as different as Orthodox, are as different as hardcore Reformed and Presbyterian. I mean, I can go down the list, 40,000. Yeah.
Yeah.
A charismatic and a Reformed person are so far apart. They might be more far apart than the average Christian, average Muslim. I don't know.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, that was one of the shocking things that I realized when you kind of touched on, Martin, was that a lot of the Muslims that I met were very curious about Jesus and would come and sit and read through the Gospel of Mark with us, or come to our house church and hang out with us, and we're not offended at all, and we're actually really interested in learning about Jesus, which is funny because here are Muslims showing curiosity about what we think about Jesus, and them coming to our gatherings, coming to fellowship with us with curiosity about that, wanting to say, what can I learn? And I just wish more Christians had that same kind of attitude.
And yet sometimes Christians are afraid. I've had people afraid to join us for fear they would be hurt if they came into a room with Muslims in it. And it's just, it's sad. But just to be clear, Peace Catalyst does not try to convert Muslims to an American expression of Christianity. What we do is we point people to Jesus as the perfect example, the person that we should emulate and follow. So it's a Jesus-centric, a Christ-centered ministry or work instead of a Christian-centered ministry. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
No, totally. I mean, that's one of the things I appreciated, is that it's not about some sort of subversive, creative way for Christians to evangelize Muslims and make. Your goal is not to make Muslims into Christians.
Correct. Our goal is to seek God together, and we find Jesus and a wonderful pathway to do that.
Yeah, and so creating connections and friendships and relationships between Christians and Muslims that are based on just genuine human interaction, which
Right.
is a beautiful, refreshing thing.
Right.
So let me just ask you this part here. So Martin, if anyone's listening to you talk about Peace Catalyst and they're like, man, that sounds really cool. How do I get involved with Peace Catalyst? Is there one in my city or is there one in my town?
Yeah.
Can I maybe start something like this where I live? I mean, where can people find out about that, and what should they do about that?
Well, on our webpage, peacecatalyst.org, is a good starting place. You can follow us on Facebook. Peace Catalyst International is how it's known there. The different cities sometimes have regional Facebook pages. Like I have one that's called Peace Catalyst International Midwest Region. So those are ways to find out. But we are actively trying to recruit people to be peacemakers. Blessed are the peace. You want to be blessed? Come join us and be a peacemaker. We follow the Prince of Peace. We build intentional relationships with Muslims. We invite Christians to join us in those relationships, and we're just excited to see what doors the Lord opens as Christians deconstruct some of the things they've been taught, not only about their own faith, but about Islam too. And what we see is we watch our Muslims deconstruct what they have learned about Christians and even Islam. Sometimes, we don't try to dismantle Islam. We let the Holy Spirit lead us to the truth and to the conversations as they seem relevant. That's why we just read through one of the Gospels instead of doing topical studies. We don't want to seem like we're trying to ambush anybody.
Yeah, that's excellent.
So yeah, that's the best way to do it. I'm pretty proud of what is going on in Sarajevo. When it was Yugoslavia, you had Muslim minority people living under Serbian Orthodox and Croatian Catholics and having to navigate that interreligious situation. Well, then, of course, it all fell apart in war, but there have been Muslim peacemakers there navigating that for years in a very contentious environment. Our Peace Catalyst people arrange trips for Americans, Europeans, Middle Easterners to go learn from these Muslim peacemakers. How have you navigated this? The churches have done so many short-term mission trips where, we go paint a wall somewhere or take clothing somewhere, and all those help ministries need to happen. But we're calling people to go on learning trips, go to a Muslim country and see who is there, what they're doing, how they approach life, how they approach their faith, and we will learn from that.
Yeah.
So we're inviting people to join us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's awesome.
Yeah. Sounds like powerful stuff. So if you're listening, please go check out the website. And Martin, we appreciate you coming on the show. It's been a blast. It's been enlightening and informative.
Yeah, thanks,
you.
Martin.
So thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. That was great. So great conversation. Love what Peace Catalyst is doing, and there was some really good stuff there. So I think the great thing is a lot of what we talked about with Martin Brooks is leads us into our topic for this podcast, which is the question about just war. And I know I have a lot of strong opinions about this. I believe we're mostly on the same page, but I guess we'll find out as we go along here. Just war, right? What do you guys think? Can Christians support war? Is there a time for war? Is war sometimes something that's a good thing, that it's necessary?
No.
Yeah, okay, that's what I think too. All right, thanks for listening, everybody. I can't tell you how much I would love this podcast right now if this was really the ending. If this was really, thanks everybody. All right, let's go to the announcements. But I guess
we've only been going for a little.
Right?
We have to fill some more time. I think we have to flesh that out a little bit.
I struggle with the question.
I do too.
To be honest.
Okay, why?
okay, can a Christian, is just war a viable option for Christians? Well, first, okay, and not to be nitpicky here, but what does that mean? It's not okay for Christians, but it's okay for everybody else. I mean, I just don't see the world like that anymore. I understand the listener and I understand the question. It's a great question. But I would say it a little differently. I would say, how effective is just war, or war for any reason for that matter?
War in general, yeah.
And this goes beyond a certain sect or label like Christian, because honestly, I don't think Jesus taught us to look at the world that way, as through like, I mean, it's just people. So I don't think war accomplishes healing or restoration. I think that's pretty clear. But I get the heart of his question, which is there ever a time for it? Like, is it a sin? Is it good or bad? Kind of a thing.
Well, yeah.
I wouldn't, I'm not against just war. However, I'm not against it like it's a sin, like it's wrong. I wouldn't say it's wrong.
Well, and that was what Augustine was first trying to do within Christian doctrine, is to ask that very question. And I think what he came up with, if I'm remembering correctly, was it's like the last resort in doing something that you think is right, but you still lament the fact that you're doing it.
Right.
So in some instances, in the most extenuating circumstances, it could be necessary, but you would need to lament the fact that I have a problem with that on a number of levels, because it could be used and abused to suggest that maybe, going to a war with Iran right now we need to lament it, but it's necessary,
right.
and we could do it to justify invading the Middle East to begin with, like Afghanistan, Iraq, like all these, and then we start using the just war and say, well, this is extenuating circumstances, and some of us are like, no, the fuck it isn't.
No, see, this is to me the problem with the whole just war theory, just as a concept, that frankly, those that embrace just war theory pretty much have never met a war that wasn't just or justified, right? In other words, you always look for those things that will justify it, to say, okay, because of these horrible evils, this is a just war. And so that's kind of the problem, I think. And then even the war that I think most people, if you want to have a conversation about just war, as just sometimes this is this thing that you have to do it reluctantly, right? Because this is the only way to solve the problem.
Right.
Well, so World War II is probably the biggest example, right? It's World War II because,
obviously,
I think most of us have been told that. And if that's all you've ever been told, then you would say, well, yeah, the best example of just war would be World War II. However, it really doesn't fit the criteria when you look at it. And especially if you look at the cost of that war. And I don't just mean in money, I mean in just, destruction and death and what it did to our planet. I mean, what we ended up with the fruit of World War II was the death of 80,000 people in Hiroshima, 60,000 people dead after that due to radiation poisoning, 73,000 people killed in Nagasaki, another 70,000 dead after that due to radiation, 50 plus years of a Cold War, the development of nuclear weapons and a nuclear arms race that continues to this day. We have enough nuclear weapons to destroy the planet multiple times over. We have a total of 70 million dead at the end of World War II. And I mean, that's a massive, massive cost that we're still paying, that we're still suffering from today. And I understand that people, the argumentation is for World War II is that, this is the only way we could have stopped the Nazi Germany's, but the Hitler and all that. But that isn't really the case either. So what I think we should do is, if you're a Patreon supporter, we're gonna record a special conversation just for our Patreon supporters to talk about World War II specifically and go into a lot of more depth and detail about World War II and how it could have been prevented through nonviolent means. and we'll do that. We'll do that over in our bonus content.
Well, I think first of all, it's interesting that Jesus talked about love your enemies, and do good to those who persecute you and hurt you and all that. But even with that said, that's not actually done by people who would say, "Oh yeah, I'm a follower of Jesus." And so people, Christians, will always say, "Well, we're not Jesus, we're
Right.
sinful," all these kinds of things. But there's no attempt to do this at a collective level, national level. Even though you can read it, going back to the people who say, okay, we really, follow the Bible, we follow the teachings of Jesus. You can read that and it's still not done. It's rarely done even on a personal level. Forget about the national. It's not done on a personal level. Just put that.
No,
way.
it's not.
So it's useless, the teachings of Jesus. Wouldn't you say? Doesn't work.
Essentially, yeah.
Okay, and so here's what, and I'm not saying that to be.
I mean, well, let me say, it works. It works if we would do it, but we don't do it, so therefore it doesn't work.
Well, but why don't we do it? So that's the thing. Reading it and knowing that Jesus said to do it does not produce the actual actions of peace. And I think that's where we have to really look a little deeper and go, well, why doesn't it? So you're never, just because Jesus said love your enemies doesn't mean you're going to do that. It's just not. It's actually impossible to do.
Well, it's not impossible to do. You just have to decide that you want to at least attempt it.
Well, but you can attempt it, but you're going to fail at it. So here's my point. I don't think Jesus is issuing a new command. A lot of times what we do is we take the teachings of Jesus and we'll make them into new laws. Well, it's the law of loving your neighbor. It's like, that's not actually a law. And it's not a law in the way that the old covenant was the law, that we have those commandments. I think that's how we approach it. And that's where we go wrong. I think what Jesus is talking about is he's talking about a completely different reality. So, and this is where I think the conversation about ego comes in, because you cannot have a war without ego. The ego is responsible for all warfare, in my opinion. This is my understanding. All conflict in the world comes from the ego. And as long as the ego tries to honor the commands of Jesus, you're going to fail at it. You can try all you want. You're going to fail because it's not possible. I don't think Jesus is actually giving instructions to the ego. I think Jesus is describing a new realm, a new reality. That's just my understanding because I think if we don't embrace, so here's the thing, you have a bunch of people that are identified with the ego, and then we hear the teachings of Jesus and we go, whoa, man, that's a high standard. And then we try to do it and feel like failures and then call ourselves sinners and then repent of that and then try to do better next time. And that's the miserable history of Christianity. But I don't think that's the whole, it's like trying to put the finest wine in a container that is just full of holes. It doesn't work. It cannot contain it.
Right.
So you almost have to have a completely new apparatus to be able to understand that. So this idea of peace, really comes down to when we stop identifying with the ego, we identify with the highest self, the truest self. There's no war to fight. And again, a war on war is still war. A war against religion is still a war against religion, a war against, whatever it is. These wars we fight on a personal level. What you see out there in the world, what you see at a societal level against nation is simply a mirror reflection of what goes on at the personal level. And until we stop fighting our own personal wars, we're never going to see peace on the earth. I'm convinced of that.
Well, I would say, I think that's one perspective. I disagree that it doesn't work, because I think we do have lots of examples throughout history of people who really did succeed in loving their enemies. We see the early church doing it for about 300 years. We see the Anabaptists doing it. We see examples of it, all over the world, actually, of examples of people who took those commands seriously. And I don't think of it in the way you're saying, like of a commandment in the sense of following this new set of rules. I do think it's more, frankly, I think it's actually more of like the what Rene Girard would call mimetic, in the sense that our violence is mimetic. And so Jesus is saying, to follow me, in the sense of, I'm someone who isn't violent. I'm someone who doesn't behave that way towards my enemies. And by following that example that Jesus has set, that we can accomplish that we can do that. And I think there are examples of us doing that. And but I do agree with you that you really can't fight a war without people willing to fight in that war. I think if more Christians took seriously that command of saying, I'm going to love my enemy, which means, by the way, I would never kill anyone I loved. I think that's pretty obvious. I think most people can agree that if you love somebody, you really love someone, you're probably not going to kill them. And I think that's very simple to understand. And so if we are saying that we are followers of Jesus, then and we're commanded to love our enemies, that step one, don't kill them. Simply because they were born in another country and they're wearing a different color uniform and they march under a different flag or whatever. What we don't understand is that quite often when Christians do go to war, they're killing other Christians. I mean, this is that insanity of it, where basically we become the tool of the state because of nationalism. We let ourselves be manipulated. And, like I tell this story in Jesus Untangled about this. It's actually a story Philip Yancey tells, but I share it in the book about how this is a true story. There's a guy during World War II, and he was walking around in the morning after the Battle of the Bulge, and was basically killing survivors, like German soldiers that were laying on the battlefield. If they were wounded, he was just walking around shooting them dead because they had no way to deal with the wounded. They had nowhere to put them. They couldn't take care of them. And so that was what he was doing. And so as he's walking around doing this, he sees a German soldier sitting under a tree, and he's actually not wounded. He's just exhausted. And so he walks up to the guy, he picks up his rifle, and he's like getting ready to kill this guy. And the guy in English, now this German soldier in English says, give me a moment to pray. And so the guy goes, he's shocked, and he says, oh, you speak English? He goes, yeah. And he goes, are you a Christian? And the German soldier says, yes, I'm a Christian. And the man says, oh, I am too. So they actually, this is insane. They sit down together, this American soldier and this German soldier. One of them pulls out a Bible. They share some scriptures together. They share pictures of their family. They pray for each other and each other's family members. And after they finish praying, the American soldier stands up, looks at this German brother in Christ that he just spent this time in fellowship with, and says, I guess we'll meet again in heaven one day, and pulls out his gun and shoots the man dead. And that's the kind of insanity that Christians participate in when we prioritize our identity in our nationalism or our tribalism, right? And not in our identity as followers of Christ. That no, if we're following Jesus, we wouldn't do these things if that was our priority.
Well, yeah, and I think that's why both of you guys are actually right. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Jamal, what you're saying is that we don't actually follow Jesus because we read about it, or that Jesus said to follow him. We follow this way because it's our true nature. And see, the story is obscenely powerful, but also grotesque at the same time that you just told, Keith, because I mean it's obvious. But this is what happens when we identify with a us tribe and a them tribe. And it wasn't that they had some shared identity in the nature of the universal Christ or right. Jesus. It was that they were German and American, and they were therefore enemies. And I did write a book about this stuff, From the Blood of Abel, if anyone wants to check it out, on why we have this violence towards each other. I mean, even to the point where they just read their scriptures together and hung out, and I'm sure had a nice time, and then one blows the other one away. That's why I think both you guys are right, that I think Jesus does both things. He tries to get us to our identity in Christ. And when we do that, right, we see that in the other, and therefore we don't have war with each other. And he also says at the same time, follow me because I'll show you that way, because you need a model, because we are mimetic, because we are going to follow someone. This is just our anthropology. It's the reality of the situation. And so therefore I'll be that icon. That's why I love Richard Rohr when he talks about Jesus as an icon, rather than some sort of metaphysical thing we have to affirm, as an icon that we can really do on a human level. We can do this Jesus way.
Right. And
It's
Gandhi did that.
it's not some abstract thing,
Well,
you know?
Right. I think that story that here's what's interesting. That story from the Yancey talked about like that Christian American soldier found a Christian German soldier and gave him, showed him a little bit of mercy because he was a Christian, gave him a little bit, a few moments to pray. And let's just say he didn't shoot him because he's a Christian. Would that make it any better?
Yes.
See, I don't think,
a lot better.
No.
It would make it so much better.
Actually, I have the opposite view. I think if he did not, let's say he spared him because he's a Christian. He's always my brother. I'm not going to shoot you. I think it highlights the evils of Christianity and of sectarianism because he killed all those other people because they weren't Christians.
No, but he didn't know they were Christians. I bet you that happened. And probably were.
They were human. They were human. So we don't spare. It's like,
but if he was a Muslim, he would have blown him away.
Totally.
Is that what you're saying, like Jamal? And then that's more evil. That's I think the evil of the sectarianism.
I don't care what his beliefs are. He's a human being. So therefore, you don't kill him.
No.
So the thing,
and I'm saying the same thing. No, but Jesus isn't saying don't kill Christians. Right. Jesus is saying don't kill anybody.
But our identity isn't found because we're followers of Christ, whatever that means. Our identity is in the fact that we are. This is what I think when you come out of the ego-based identity, which can associate with religious tribe or national tribe or whatever. That's all ego. So stepping out of that, you recognize self and all these other people as human beings. And I think that's what Jesus was really the heart of what he was trying to say is like, this is why you don't do that because it's really yourself.
Right. Because Jesus actually said, love your enemies, which is not, he wasn't saying only love people like you, which would be, I'm only going to love Christians. But if you're not a Christian, I'm going to blow your brains out. No, following Jesus would be, I'm going to love both people who are like me and people who aren't like me. And that's what Jesus did too, right? So again, that would be following that example and that teaching that what I should do is love even those who don't love me, even those who aren't in my tribe, who aren't like me, who don't believe like me, think like me, or any of those things.
Totally. And
if we did that, then all war, not just war, but all war. Of course,
you wouldn't have war. But I don't think that's actually possible from an egoic identification. As long as human beings are identifying with the ego, you can try to obey that command, and it will not. It just won't happen.
So how did Gandhi do that? How did Gandhi do it?
I don't think Gandhi had ego identification. I think Gandhi was awakened to his higher self.
Yeah, but but Gandhi would say, and he says this in his own writings, that he followed that path because he was impressed by Jesus and his teachings. He read the Sermon on the Mount every day. Mm-hmm. And he was, you know what I mean? That was a driving factor. I know he was. I know he was, but he was a follower of Jesus. He would not say he's a Christian, but by the way he lived his life, he was following that example and that teaching, and therefore doing a better job of following Jesus than most Christians I know.
Absolutely. And the Buddha. The Buddha also lived like Jesus before Jesus' writings were available, and before Jesus was even alive on the earth. So the idea is but I also you can make the point that the Buddha did not identify with ego, which is the whole point. It's this concept of we don't need Jesus' teachings to be peaceful, like the Buddha demonstrated, like Gandhi demonstrated. Gandhi was not taking his instructions from the Sermon on the Mount. I think he could recognize the truth of that from the Sermon on the Mount, looking at it and going, but I think that the internal resonation. So if we're taking our commands from written words that Jesus gave, then I think that's where the problem is. It's like, this is, again, it goes back to, I remember listening to a presidential candidate last election. They said, do you is the Bible your source of authority for how you interact in the world? And he goes, no, I love the Bible, but I tell you what, I love my wife, not because the Bible says to love my wife, just because I do. I love my family because I do. Again, what's the reference point? Are we referencing scripture? Are we referencing some guru that lived 2,000 years ago as our point of reference? Or is the reference internal? And I honestly think that if you're going to follow Christ, you have to follow an internal reference guide. And by Christ, I'm not talking about Jesus. I'm talking about this reality of divinity that is at the level of being. And that's where I think we're missing it, because people who aren't identified with their true and highest self, these are just commands to be strived for, and we fail at it. And we're never going to, and again, it comes down to in personal life. What wars are we fighting? Have we achieved world peace? And
that's a good point too, because I was thinking about this driving home from work today on what I might want to say in this episode. And I kept thinking, like, we all talk about war, just war. Is it justified? When do we do this? When do we do that? But I think a lot of people would not send themselves.
Oh, yeah.
And so it's like, well, we're not willing to do these things that we want to talk about and theorize over. So I've always found it interesting that, I don't even have a place to talk about just war because I'm not about to go. So therefore I can't justify doing it because I have to learn how to be at peace with myself first before I can even abstractly talk about these ideas. And if I'm not really at peace with myself, if I'm battling this thing internally or whatever, that's where I think the heart of it is at. So I think you're right. Like if we're having this big time war with our ego, we're not going to be we're not at a place to talk about peace in the world because we're not at peace internally.
Totally.
Yeah. I think, this is something, well, I hear what you're saying, Matt, but I do think though, I would say there is obviously though, people do send their children to fight in wars and do so proudly, with tears in their eyes. And you know what I mean? And so in other words, I was thinking of the phrase, an idol is anything you'll sacrifice your children to. And unfortunately that is sort of, nationalism and that the flag, your love for your country and your flag is, you'll gladly send your children off to die for some ridiculous thing. But I like what you said about this sort of personal level of it. I was reading several years ago, someone asked me to read some of the letters of Gandhi, and it was really fascinating, and it really challenged me because Gandhi talks about nonviolence not simply as I don't agree with violence, or I don't use violence as a method of reaction, and it is that. But he took it to a much, much deeper level of that it's just not even something that's part of your mind, of your life, of your reality. And frankly, this may sound weird, but it's the reason why I stopped playing video games. Because I at the time I was struggling with the fact that, I was somebody who didn't believe in violence and, thought nonviolence was the way to go and pacifism and all that. And yet, for fun, I would go and play a violent video game. And, in the game, I've got a machine gun and I'm blowing people up and blowing their heads off and taking headshots and being entertained by this violence. Now, it's not real violence, right? It's mock violence. It's pretend, but it's very realistic. And I just had to step back and say, why? Like, in other words, what is my commitment to nonviolence if I'm still slightly entertained by violence? If I still turn to violence as a sort of an escape or an outlet or something like that? And so, and again, I'm not trying to say everybody should do this. I'm just saying, like, it kind of came down to me personally of something where, like, I had to figure out, like, how seriously I took this idea of nonviolence. Like, was I willing to take it to sort of that deeper personal level of how do I respond? Just even just the way I live my life.
Well, I tell you what if I think just war happens a lot more than we put it in a military context, but let's just bring it back to the personal stuff. I mean, go on Facebook at any given day and you see just wars going on. Mm-hmm. The LGBTQ plus defenders are fighting against the bigots, the religious bigots. That's a just war. The vice versa, the conservative folks that are thinking that, the liberal progressives are leading the country to hell. That's a just war, and they're fighting against them. You know what? We participate in those. You know what I mean? Yeah. And again, do the LGBTQ plus people that feel ostracized because folks are against them, that they feel very justified in their struggle. War. You can have a war against war. You can have a war on drugs. You can have a war on poverty. You can have a war on all these different things. These are all just wars, and we can make a case that they're just. However, at some point, you have to stop fighting the wars to achieve world peace, and that doesn't mean you agree. It just means you stop fighting, and you in order to do that. Yeah, and that is where it gets controversial, because it's like, so you just turn a blind eye to injustice. So you turn but it's getting to a place at the personal level where you just stop fighting the wars. You let people be where you are, and you live into a higher reality. And this, again, can only happen when we stop identifying with the ego, because the ego needs a war to justify its existence. It's just a fact. You can't escape war without getting away from the ego. But we can get away from the ego when we begin to identify with the highest and truest, and I would say our divine self, the light of the world that Jesus talked about, which is what we are in our essence. We are the light. Follow Jesus, I don't care what tribe you put somebody on, what label you put just who you are. When you start to realize that self, you can't fight a war because there's nothing to fight.
Yeah. Yeah. And to reiterate, it's when you don't fight the war that's against you with this, you don't fight that with the same energy that it was brought to you. You know what I mean? Like you can, of course, justice for ostracized groups, of course, all that stuff. It's just saying that in order to actually get that justice, you can't hit them back with the same exact tit for tat. And that's what we're talking about. That's the war.
No.
That's the same energy that is kind of ruining things. So you got to get to a different place where you're able to fight these fights without fighting, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
You know?
No, exactly. And see, this is exactly right. And see, I think this is where it comes down to however you get there. And Jamal and I might disagree on how someone gets there. Maybe we're both right, and maybe there are multiple ways to get there. But one way or the other, we have to come to the place where we don't see us and them. We don't see other people as the other. And I believe actually Jesus has a lot to say about that. I think this is a big, big part of his message, is that there is no other, that there is just us. And this is, you have to come to that place before you can even begin to love your enemy. You have to see them as human beings, just like you. You have to value their life, value their perspective, value their right to exist. All these things, and you have to do that at a basic level to love your enemy, to love other people, to become someone who is loving. And then and only then can you not only love your enemy, but you can win the battle without fighting the battle. You can disarm your enemy in a way that kind of brings them along with you rather than overcomes them, right? It's just power under versus power over. And I do think there is something to that. I do think actually, if you study this idea of nonviolence, if you study different times in history when this has been employed, there's an amazing documentary called Pray the Devil Back to Hell. It's a true story. I think this happened in the early 90s, I want to say, in the country of Liberia. And it was a movement of women, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish women, who bound together and basically overturned a dictator in their government, non-violently. They would sing songs, they would pray, they would just basically sit, and block the roads and refuse to leave. And I mean, it was a non-violent movement that overturned a violent dictator, changed the face of that nation, saved their children who were being turned into child soldiers and all this stuff. And that's just one example. There's so many examples of these kinds of things throughout history where essentially love conquers hate, where essentially, amazing changes can be made without violence, without war. And it's possible. And we just have to be committed to finding those solutions.
Yeah. And something you said earlier, Keith, reminds me, you said, instead of just war, you said just us. There's no them. And we have a shirt on our website, heretichappyhour.com/store that says just us. And that's exactly what you're talking about. And that's why we got that shirt. So that's my way of telling people that we have a website and a store. And one last thing before I'm done talking, we have a Facebook group. So if you want to join that, well, we have two Facebook groups, sort of. We have the Heresy After Hours, which we're sort of involved in. And then that's like the public group and everything. And then we have the Heretic Happy Hour podcast group specifically for the show that you must be a Patreon supporter to join. So go do that.
And I'm glad you mentioned that magic word, Patreon. We want to thank all of our Patreon supporters, people, amazing people. These are the best people on earth. And these people are awesome because they love the Heretic Happy Hour so much. They're supporting us with a little bit of extra support every month. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And as a thank you, we give them bonus interviews, bonus content, and not only that. By the way, if you're a Patreon supporter, You have probably been waiting for this for a long time. When we first started the podcast and we first started our Patreon page, we talked about doing a board game. I believe it's called The Slippery Slope. Well, some of you thought we'd forgotten about it. Oh, no, we have not forgotten about it. Ladies and gentlemen, I am so thrilled to announce that the Slippery Slope board game it's nearing completion. And here's how we did it, guys. We had to go to the big guns. We reached out to probably one of the greatest Christian deconstruction sort of voices that are out there. And he also is a great artist with a great sense of humor. David Hayward, you may know him as the Naked Pastor. Yes. I'm tingling. I can't even believe I'm saying these words in English right now. They're coming out of my mouth into the microphone and out onto the internet, but they are. Yes, guys. David Hayward, the Naked Pastor, is partnering with the Heretic Happy Hour to create the world's most awesome deconstruction board game, The Slippery Slope. It's coming at you. That's right.
That's right. And by the way, guys, we are on iTunes, and so you can rate us and review us. I decided to rate us and review us on iTunes. I was like, you know what? Maybe
somebody
I should
did
do that. Maybe because it's like, I've been listening to the podcast for a couple years now, so I'm like, let me do that. So I wrote a review on there. And
Did you see the ones before yours? Oh, they were terrible. Quite scathing.
Dude, we need some positive reviews.
I know.
Come on, help us out, people.
If you send a negative review, we'll attack you. That would be a just war. So don't do that.
Yes.
Just positive
That's right.
reviews.
Don't make us